Oh, it's quite low.
Think I'm low.
Yeah,
That's
that's better. That's better. That's better. All right. Oh, we're live.
We're live already.
All right. So this is episode. Wait, what are we? Episode 5 of Unplanned with Phil Bland, and it's my guest Mark Hogarth. He's a good friend of mine, and also creative director of Harris Tweed. Right. And it's quite low. Oh, and does a lot of other creative endeavors, which I'm sure we'll kind of touch on. So thanks for joining us, Mark. So yeah, how are you coping with isolation, quarantine?
I'm coping fine. I work from home normally, so the dynamic of changing from a workspace to home working was easy for me. I think the big change was really adapting to the new business environment, which was a big sea change. It all happened very, very fast in the UK. There was an initial thought that there may have been herd mentality and herd immunity rather, and of course that switched very fast to full lockdown, and that had huge implications for all industries, including the fashion and textiles industry, which I work in.
Mm. Yeah, it's been funny. It's actually different people have different like personal experiences of this. I guess some people are like, if they've got kids at home, then it's like must be. I was speaking to my sister, and she was like telling me about working from home with the kids, and they're just, they have a good day if she gets more than 4 hours sleep,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's a bit crazy. Whereas some other people, like I guess yourself and others, can just work from home, and it's no kind of major change. It's actually probably more positive from a kind of personal perspective because you can just wake up and go about your day.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense of privilege that I feel vis-a-vis people, that maybe don't have a home environment that can more easily double as a work environment. I do really feel for people with families. I I also feel for other people as well who are put out, people that have been furloughed, people that are going to lose their jobs. So I think those of us who are in relatively privileged positions and that we're still working, albeit on reduced wages or indeed reduced hours, you have to make the most of it. You have to make the most of your work time. I've actually been really creative over the last 6 weeks because you've got a little bit more time to think, and whereby you may sometimes be rushing through a day and you may be on several deadlines. I'm still busy, but I've got a little bit more time to plan. One of the biggest elements of my work as creative director of Harris Tweed is there is a lot of travelling, certainly not as much travelling as there was perhaps in the first 5 years when we were building up the business, whereby we had to actively go into new markets or indeed to go into traditional markets and try to reinvigorate those markets. Now, not that we're in any ways at a plateau, but we're just a little bit more strategic. And I think that's very much in line with the whole dynamic of climate change as well, where we've realised that perhaps you have to be a bit more strategic with your travel, particularly with my colleagues who look after more the direct sales element of the business. They still go to trade shows, but they have to be a bit more strategic because obviously everything when you have a business in the Outer Hebrides is a little bit more expensive. It's more expensive to get petrol there. It's more expensive to travel there. It's more expensive to transfer your finished goods from the Outer Hebrides to the various corners of the globe. So we've always been a bit more conscious of travel and what value you're getting from travel and what value you're getting from face-to-face business engagement.
Yeah, it's also like we were talking about this before, but it's kind of like if brands are like say sustainability and being environmentally friendly is like part of a brand, then it should also be kind of embedded in the culture of the way that the company operates. Otherwise, like there's an inherent almost hypocrisy that can come out from like a company that operates where people fly around all over the world, but yet, you know, preach sustainability. So yeah, I think that's cool as well. I think this whole thing about us just all slowing down, having more time to think, and then also like innovating and thinking about new ways of doing things is actually, there's going to be some net positive of the coronavirus period where we're all going to come out of this and actually think that we've made progress in areas which we weren't necessarily planning to focus on this year, but yet will kind of set people up for a new digital world where, you know, this was kind of the direction that we were all heading in, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if the fashion and textiles industry was one of the biggest polluters, I don't have the science, the facts, or indeed the alternative facts in front of me, but along with the agriculture and the transport, general industry, whether you define that as being aviation or not, you know, it's certainly up there with the top 3 polluters. Inherent in the fashion industry, it goes all the way back to you know, the famous Oscar Wilde quote that fashion is such a terrible idea that it has to reinvent itself every 6 months. So that element of fashion is now under considerable scrutiny. There is organisations like Fashion Revolution who had their focus week 2 weeks ago. That was born off the back of the Rana Plaza disaster, where over 1,000 people died under very, very dubious health and safety conditions in a factory in Bangladesh. And of course, once you started to examine that, it was at the basis of the supply chain, the fast fashion supply chain, which of course serves the UK and other Western countries. It was at the fulcrum of globalization as well. And people had to start to question that. Off the back of that, you get initiatives that are essentially encouraging people to not buy any clothes at all at the extreme, or indeed go vegan, make sure that you know, workers have got full paid wages, you know, all very fine and well, but people still need and want to buy clothes. I would say I was not necessarily a fashion revolutionist, but very much a fashion evolutionist, in the same way that I do believe over time we will eat less meat and eat more vegetables. I do believe we will have an understanding of how clothes are made, what they are made for. So therefore, the ethical complexity of a piece of clothing and everything from the labour and indeed the raw materials that have gone into that clothes will be examined and evaluated by the consumer. I really do think that when it comes to fashion, on the production side, we can change, but ultimately what will change or have the most change will be the consumers. And that's been the exact same in the food industry, where big companies now, the 4 big supermarkets in the UK and various other companies have adapted to the fact that people have got a hunger and a desire for more vegetarian and more vegan products. And I think that will be the way forward for fashion.
And do you think that that is driven by, it's an interesting dynamic with consumers about where, I guess, we've moved to the place that we've been in terms of fast fashion, fast food, because of convenience, because I guess consumers valued convenience, and it was, you know, saving them time, saving them money. And then it seems like there's a new value system for consumers that values maybe a different set of things that aren't specifically related to saving time or money, that might be like how their purchases are perceived by their peers, or just other things that aren't so like driven by like the numbers and efficiency that's been gained over time. And you kind of see, but I guess I wonder how far you can take that. Like, how far do you think consumers would be willing to go to like have inconvenience at the expense like of being able to like feel good about their purchases and things like that? Like, especially now that we're coming out of coronavirus, or as we come out of this, a lot a lot of the world slowed down, and that means we're going to be traveling less at the moment. And the beautiful sunsets that you see across the sky and all the nature coming back, it kind of makes you remember that there are kind of there are other things which you could value, that we kind of have forgotten about. And but I just kind of wonder, like, whether we'll snap back to just caring about efficiency and time and like cheapness, or whether this will have a lasting impact on like consumer driver purchasing decision making, I guess.
I think it's an interesting one. If you think of the large events that fostered paradigmatic changes, perhaps over the last 20 years, the changes perhaps weren't as big as what the media or indeed what the scientists thought at the time. So 9/11, people thought, oh, it's all change, it's going to be mass security, it's going to be so much more difficult to travel, people are going to be scared to travel. Didn't really quite happen. People were a bit nervous for the next 4 or 5 years, and then it kind of drifted away to terrorism being not at the forefront of society or indeed societal changes. In 2007 into 2008, which you know a lot more about than I do, with the global economic crash, people's consuming habits definitely changed. The kind of Wolf of Wall Street materialism kind of disappeared. It wasn't nice to be blingy and to be showy, but I kind of get the feeling that maybe that sense of chutzpah came back a little bit. It's at 2014, 15 onwards.
Especially just to jump in, especially given like technology and social media allowed people to kind of, rather than owning things, they could show the people what they had, like their possessions. And so that you get stories about people renting private planes to show off on their Instagram, and it's the likes and the follows that so whilst like a big impact like the financial crisis might have had like a short-term effect, like there are kind of larger technological forces that are driving us towards efficiency and kind of status-driven decision making, which I just don't know where the balance is gonna.
I think you make a really interesting point about status-driven and efficiency, and you also made similar points about that in regards to fashion. But let's not forget the spectre of capitalism that hangs all over this. And we do live in a capitalist society, and instrumental in a capitalist society is growth. And growth is measured as more than just, and I think this is one of the seismic changes that will never come back. People don't really care now what the GDP fall is going to be, because it's meaningless. And you can't compare it to the 1930s depression, and you can't really compare it to the post-war years or indeed to the crash of 2008, because this is a state-led, in most cases, contraction of the economy, deliberate contraction of the economy. And I think that's going to have a whole different dynamic. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, countries like Iceland had decided to drop GDP as the primary indicator of their country's success. And they had to put in place of that an aggregate of mindfulness and other societal cultural factors. And I think that is going to be a big, big driver. Putting that back to my original
like gross
point.
It's like that, just on that point, I think it's gross domestic happiness or something like that. And I think David Cameron talked about that at some point, and during the most recent Liberal campaign for the election, I'm pretty sure the Liberal Democrats started bringing this concept up, because GDP doesn't really have direct, you can't just because GDP is going up or the stock market's going up, if you ask the average man or woman on the street about whether their life's getting better, they wouldn't necessarily be correlated with one another. And so what do we value? What's important? If what you measure, what you track is what you value. And if you don't track happiness, then what do you care about?
Yeah, and I think that comes back to styles as well. one of the most interesting elements about fast fashion is that even in poorer communities, it has been proven that the reason why people like to buy is not necessarily the need of buying it. It is the dopamine levels that are created from buying something. And that is really sad, but I think we're all guilty of it. I've definitely been guilty of it before, where you're not buying something because you need it. You're buying it because you want it, and you want it because you want the dopamine level of making that purchase and thinking it's going to have a positive impact in your life. So until you have help or indeed cultural dynamics that are put in place to say that we don't really need that much stuff, and there's maybe a little bit more scrutiny on certain advertising. I've got a particular concern about the amount of fast fashion adverts that are on London tubes that are aimed at girls of my niece's age. And the peer pressure that's put through Instagram and through schools about having to have something new, whether it's a new dress or a new shirt or something to show off, and then that new dress or new shirt has a very, very short shelf life because it's deemed in those younger generations not to be cool to then rewear it. Whereas in my group of slightly more advanced fashion workers, fashion, dread to use fashionistas, but people a bit more mature, I think there's a definite sea change of trying to use what's in your wardrobe and make the most of it. And almost take pride that you don't have to add to that core wardrobe because you're ultimately damaging the environment.
Yeah, but on that, it's kind of like I'd be interested in your thoughts on like people buy things. Like I think sometimes people buy things because they identify themselves with objects. Like this watch is me. Like this new blazer makes, like if it's a nice blazer, then like I value myself more because I'm wearing that. And it's kind of like what you're saying when you say people make choices about their purchases to reuse things, is because you stop gaining the value about yourself from the piece of clothing or the newness or shininess of the piece of clothing itself, but rather the story that it says about you and what you care about and what you value.
Yep. No, absolutely. It's about that becomes a story, if you can make do and mend, which was the old post-war statement, which was, I think, reiterated by HRH Princess Anne a few weeks ago, then these are huge drivers, but it's a cultural thing, as long as people, the majority of people, or even a considerable minority of people are not going to throw their nose up of that, make do and mend idea, or people are going to become more comfortable, celebrities as well. And there are some that are doing this. Like Joaquin Phoenix wore the same tuxedo to go to all the various award ceremonies this year. So these small changes will ingrain big effects. I think in the same way that there's going to become, there's a Swedish word for it. I think it's a neologism in Swedish about flight shaming. So whereas before people be showing off their gold cards and I've flown here, they've now gone the opposite way, and the people are calling them out. I think those people in so-called influential or influencer positions that continue just to showcase new clothes all the time, I think they're going to at some point get questioned, and it's not going to be. And maybe COVID is the perfect catalyst and the perfect time to do that. Now, I'm not coming from a point of view as let's stop consuming. I'm coming from the perspective of buy less, buy better. There's a great old mantra about I'm too poor to buy cheap shoes. And I kind of feel a little bit like that with fashion. If you buy a really nice, albeit quite expensive, cotton crew neck, it'll last you longer than the one that you'll get from the fast fashion that maybe you buy, but you'll have to buy another one the next year. Buy a good quality one made of really strong look back cotton, then that could last you 4 or 5 years.
It's quite interesting, this thing about the the kind of leading, whether, you know, celebrities would be able to kind of change the, you know, what God, I mean, people have been, it's all of the celebrities wearing all of these different gowns and like jewelry and things that have kind of has percolated down to society, that's made people, you know, more inclined to have fast fashion choices about what they're going to buy, because they want the newest stuff, because that's what the celebrities are constantly changing what they're wearing and things. And it'd be interesting to see how like a switch to in the behavior of kind of, I guess it's like the early adopters model, and can you get those, can you how do you drive change in societal decision makings, and which people need to make those decisions? And then also, like, quite often there's a risk there, because there's also, during this COVID time, actually, I think it'll be really interesting to look back on like conversations like this and think about what we're thinking, what might happen later. And because it's quite good to like document these conversations and then see how it actually turns out in 5-10 years. But like, there's a lot of companies or celebrities that are potentially like capitalizing on these virtues or like these kind of trends, and there's some who truly believe in it, and then there's another element to it which is can be quite hypocritical, and it's like to like virtue signal to people that they're making the right decisions. So it's quite hard to tell which ones actually mean it and which ones are just talking the talk.
Yeah, there's some really good institutions and really good, I wouldn't call them companies, it's much more communities that are now onto that. The big one in fashion industry, for example, is greenwashing. So it's an ability to say that you're sustainable because, you know, you're using certain organic cottons, but that might be for 10% of your line because it's a bit more expensive, and you're still pumping through polyesters, polyviscose, polyurethanes, and other really damaging chemicals. It's really funny because there's been such an incredible reaction on the back of the David Attenborough Blue Planet show about anti-plastics. I mean, plastic straws were banned in most places within 9 months of that incredible footage. But there's a real cognitive dissonance between synthetic clothes, which are plastic, and actually buying them. So the same people that were, oh, do you know, I don't use plastic bags, and oh, don't give me a plastic straw, will be wearing plastic clothes. You know, these are oil-based plastic fabrics. I think that's just beginning to push through now. And, you know, that's to very much the advantage of natural fibers, like Harris Tweed, which of course is 100% wool-based, or indeed cashmere at the top level, or some pretty decent merino products, which again is you know, an abundant sheep, which mostly comes from the southern hemisphere.
And then this kind of comes to the conversation that we've been having for a while during this time, which is like, these products, fast fashion products, probably aren't the best quality products, but they've been sold because they're well branded. And then you and I were having a kind of conversation about whether, you know, obviously Harris Tweed and ranges are like high quality fabrics, and that people can kind of, because you buy it, it lasts for a long time, it gets a good reputation, which can build the brand. So I guess, would you want to state your case for why products are super important?
Before we come to that, I think it's important also to just reflect on the previous stuff, and this goes for not just the textiles industry, but I think for consumer products at all, because I know we are touching on the environment slightly as well, and the whole climate change dynamic. And I think that's one of the good things that's going to come out of COVID, because I don't think you can set it aside, you know, to what is happening in the environment. The two are also not directly linked, although it could be argued that one is a product of the other, particularly in places like Africa, where deforestation has forced bats into different environments, which has then caused outbreaks of
We've managed, yeah, we've
of,
managed to
of
convince
viruses.
ourselves. We've managed to convince ourselves that we're like separate from nature
Yeah.
in some way, and every so often it comes along, and maybe because we have science, we think that any natural disaster that comes our way, we can fix it, which to some extent is probably true, but it's almost given us a sense of invulnerability
Yeah.
to natural effects, and we think that we can just take advantage of what nature has and not really respect it, because
Yeah.
if something like this comes along, then we might learn the wrong lesson, which is, oh, we'll just create a vaccine, so it's not the end of the world, we can continue go back to the way things were.
Yeah.
But actually, like, we need to find some way to like be more in harmony with nature,
Yeah.
and right now we're a bit out of kilter.
Exactly. And if you constrain that big picture down to the textiles industry where we have at the moment, if you take any good, say let's call it a basic good like a t-shirt, you've got the price of that t-shirt, which is what you pay in terms of currency. You've got the value of that t-shirt. Now that's the value it is to you. Now that value may be that I'm going to wear this t-shirt because I like this t-shirt, I'm going to wear it for years and years to come, or it may be that I'm going to wear this t-shirt on a night out, or for a specific event. I'm going to throw it back in my wardrobe and might never wear it again, and it'll end up in some landfill because I've either thrown it out or I've tried to recycle it, but there's not been the means to properly recycle it. So you then get the cost of that t-shirt. Now, before it's even been purchased, there's a cost of production. That cost of production may be propping up a system in a third world country whereby there's not a minimum wage, there's not proper health and safety involved, and the t-shirt, because it's been made so cheap, is using production methods that are dyes, etc., that are damaging to the environment. So even before you get to the value of that t-shirt in somebody's wardrobe, you've got a really long line accumulated costs already. And the final cost of that t-shirt, can be measured not in the price that you've paid, but on that whole lineage of damage to the environment, damage to a third world society who are not, how might you say, following any form of wage structures and health and safety. And that is the true cost of fashion, and indeed fast fashion. And that's why it's an industry I think we always will want to buy clothes, we always will want to buy stuff, not always even necessary stuff that we just need, to keep ourselves warm, because fashion in a way is art. It's a really accessible form of art. When we get dressed up in the morning, and we get a little bit of a dopamine rush about how we look, okay, that might be just basic pride, or it might be a touch of narcissism, or somewhere along that spectrum. But it has been important for centuries and centuries. It's not going to go away. We like clothes, we like to look good. So what is the next stage? What is the balance between that engagement with clothes, that engagement with looking good, but not this hyper insensitivity to the environment? And, with all due respect, I just don't know how we can now have billion-pound companies in the UK sending out, through classic globalization, sending out clothes that have been made in one country, they've been reassembled in another and sent out to a third. I mean, the fashion distance, the fashion miles, people used to talk about food miles, the fashion miles in that are just thousands and thousands. And I'm not sure that that's sustainable.
And who's picking up that cost, that extra cost of producing that product, like the cost to like to the environment, isn't being picked up by the company. It's not being paid for by the individual consumer that's buying the t-shirt, but it's actually being paid for by all of us.
Yeah.
But also, it's also being paid for not by us, but by future generations.
Absolutely.
And so in a way, it doesn't feel like, it's kind of like credit. The whole world's built on credit. Everybody's taking out credit cards to buy all of this stuff from fast fashion stores, and not really being careful about their necessarily careful about their purchases, but you're storing things up storing up a problem for later. And it's the same way with the environment. It's like it's hard to get people to feel like they're like it's their problem to solve when it's like, oh well, you walk out of the door and I don't see like everything's covered in smog because it's other developing countries that are making the products. So it's like hard to get people to engage with it, whereas it's been so easy for people to get engaged on the issue of the coronavirus because it's your loved ones that are at risk. So people are much more likely to take super proactive. It's like, how do you make this problem of the environment more urgent in people's minds so that it's like a call to action to actually do something today to solve a problem that is likely to occur in the future? It's just
it's a difficult one to engage because there's so many shifting plates, and obviously the economy is complex, and there's many different industries that make up an economy. But from my perspective, the luxury and fashion industries, I've just always, and incidentally, the luxury and fashion industries, they become much more than just an industry. Fashion shows, etc., used to be for that industry. They are now cultural events. They're now superstars who have made their fame through fashion, through Instagram, etc. The whole celebrity culture and the fashion industry have morphed almost into one. So it's not just about making and selling clothes anymore. It's about the image and the lifestyles that are around that.
Yep, it's an experience.
It's the whole cultural experience, and that's why music and sport have all morphed into one. I mean, brands like Adidas, Nike, hot brands like Off-White, they've become the masters of this. They've created the hype around it. I think they all have a future. I mean, some of them have been great to Harris Tweed because they've got integrity and they want to buy something that they then use and put out to their consumers that has longevity and has durability. And of course, primarily in Harris Tweed case, has heritage. I'm just not sure that as an industry, fashion is comfortable with contraction, because I don't think capitalism is comfortable with recession.
Nope.
And I think hopefully what we might all become a little bit more comfortable with and accept is contraction and recession. I'm comfortable with it. I think it'd be interesting to hear what you feel, but over the last 6 weeks, and I've been watching a little bit of East German and Cold War movies and drama shows as well. People from that era always used to say we had less, but we were happy. Or indeed, even in Scotland, you speak to people who perhaps had pretty tough working class upbringings, and they'll say poverty. We were never in poverty. We were happy. Things were tight, and occasionally too tight, but we were happy. And I think this kind of largesse of always having consumer goods and always being able to go on holiday and always being able to buy stuff. Well, buying stuff is not as important as a meaningful relationship. Buying stuff is not as important as reading a book that perhaps you would never have had the chance or indeed the time to read.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking about right now is, when you're talking about that, is the people want to grow fast, and they're impatient, and they want things now. And what most people don't realize, and what I think we're kind of beginning to get to a point where, if you accept that sometimes if you grow slow in the early, it's like an epidemic. You might have small incremental gains at the start, but if you're but that's okay. You don't need to make a quick buck today and then to crash and burn tomorrow or in a year's time. It's almost like it's okay to take things slowly at the beginning, test things, like not feel like you need to you need things immediately, and just have the faith and knowledge that if you build like a quality product and and put something out that's of value, and you do that sustainably, consistently for a long time, then all of the gains come in 10 years. Whereas people want it now and they're not patient enough to think about what they could have if they go slowly and just take the increment, step by step, incremental steps that they need to get to be at that point. And yeah, I think everything with what we're doing just now, even like me doing this YouTube show, you know, it's not as if there's any, like, although this might be an interesting conversation for some people that watch this, it's not like there's any immediate payback from a conversation like this, other than building, kind of telling stories, adding value for other people, building reputation that is like driven by trust, and just trying to put some content out there that's interesting to people. And it's those kind of long-term views that actually end up making like a giving you a bigger result at the end, rather than trying to make a quick buck by, you know, selling somebody a course online or something like that. So yeah, I guess those are some of the things, like taking a longer term viewpoint and growing slow is like yeah.
I mean, I think that comes back to one of our core conversations, whereby, you know, we're talking about products and how the investment in a product is so important, because in order for you to put a product that has an allure, that has quality, that is going to get a good reaction to the market, then that is 10 times more important than people who perhaps, or indeed companies who perhaps see a gap in the market and then throw out a brand. I'm very skeptical about that. I think these are the products that will have a short shelf life because they are put out on image, rather than having a true integrity of a quality product.
Yeah.
I do think, particularly now with everything that's going on, people are falling back on products, you know, and particularly in food and on other essentials.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the yeah, just and quality, and some of the things, you can't build it, like people think that you can build a brand or a reputation. I mean, as a person, you've got a reputation. As a company, you've got a brand, but they're the same thing. And I guess they're only ever built for the long term with one thing, which is say you're going to do something and then do it, and then do that again hundreds of times, or put out a quality product and then, you know, and then, or sit, like, tell somebody that you've got a quality product, sell them on it, and then when they buy it, they find out whether that's the truth or not. And if you do that consistently over a period of time, then you can use that product to build your brand, and that's much more valuable than flashy marketing.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, that's always been the case, because if you are putting out a product that gets a bad review, then you don't have a brand. Your brand's gone. You've got brand damage. You know, and that's why some of the big car companies, when they get into trouble, they'll just pull. They've got the ability to do that. Some of the smaller companies that maybe put out a bad jacket with an ill-fitting zip, you know, they will not have the ability to do that, or they'll maybe try and cut a corner by not doing it. But the same company that puts out a jacket 2 or 3 times with a bad zip, or perhaps buttons that's not properly been stitched, their product is then seen in the eyes of the consumer as being defective, and their brand is gone, you know, or any brand value that they had, brand equity that they had, is gone. So this is why I know we have slight disagreements on this, but for me, the product always prevails over the brand, because the brand is the consumer's reaction to the product.
Yeah, and like it's quite hard to like separate the two concepts, because the brand can also be the product can also be a product of the purpose, the what you want to, I guess any individual wants to just express themselves in any way, shape or form. A company is a collective group of people coming together to have some sense of expression, and whether that's a physical product or whether it's media company or a band making music, it's just any form of self-expression. So I guess the reputation for an individual and the brand of a company comes from that group of people choosing to express themselves in any form of way. And if they make the collective or individual or collective decision to express themselves in a way that doesn't respect the consumer of their self-expression, then they are not going to be able to build trust with that audience or with that consumer or customer, and it's that trust that over time builds a brand. But ultimately it does also start with like your view on why you're creating the product and the story that you tell yourself. So like before Harris Tweed makes any jackets or before the product's even made, the company collectively has to make a decision to make quality products. And if the brand is about making quality products, then it's hard to differentiate between the collective decision to make that, the collective story that group of people tell themselves about the type of product that they want to make, versus how the consumer would receive it. And so that I guess culture, that kind of comes back to what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, was the difference between culture and brand. And it's the culture of the group of people who are making the decision to collectively express themselves in a quality way that creates that brand. But these things just kind of, there's quite a fluid concept, and it's hard to decipher how they can be separated from one another.
I mean, again, it's that interaction between industry and indeed the companies within certain industries, and this big, bad sea called capitalism. If you get a family-owned company, they tend to have a bit more integrity, and that's what they want to do and what they love. Once you start getting investment, and once you start getting companies, who really explode and go public, it's very, very hard to keep that integrity, which is focused on the product. I mean, there's some companies that have gone a little bit by the wayside on that, and they fall fast and they fall far. Sometimes through no fault of management, sometimes just through the fault of licensees. But in the fashion industry, you'll get many cases where people will go down a wholesale route, and then they'll just lose touch and lose control over how their product's being portrayed. And if you lose control over how your product's been portrayed at a retail level, then of course you lose control over how it's been perceived. Some of the best companies in the UK, for example, I think they're generically called Snow Whites. This is smaller companies who, it's almost my analogy for them. They're like a classic car, like a Ferrari or a Aston Martin, but they're just consciously stuck in second gear because they don't want to get into third gear or fourth gear, because they don't have to. They're perfectly happy making the volume that they can to make sure that the quality control is there. And from a consumer point of view, that is so alluring. That's so alluring.
In terms of quality, yes, but not in terms necessarily of price, because they can't get the volumes up to get that product to market. That's just a tricky one.
No, but I mean, I don't think those specific ones that price is very important, because they'll be charging a fair price because they don't have shareholders or to put pressure on them to put the price up or to increase the supply chain. I think those are the kind of products that have the most integrity. If, of course, you're a business consultant and you go into that business and you see this quality product, maybe you see the price as well, and you see the potential for them making more, then of course that's what you would push on. But like Harris Tweed, for example, we always try to keep supply in tune with the demand. The demand, more often than not, is maybe a little bit higher than the supply, and we could certainly manipulate the demand as well through pushing much deeper investment into advertising. But the primary dynamic of Harris Tweed is that it is held in trust for the islanders of the Outer Hebrides.
Mm.
You know, that is the absolute framework of that industry, is to provide, you know, jobs and provide quality jobs in what is ultimately quite a vulnerable socioeconomic part of the United Kingdom. So
Mm.
that again goes back to our part we were talking earlier about Iceland and about redefining our society and redefining our you know, whole industries away from profit increase, you know, better sales figures,
Mhm.
to slightly more constrained. Because I think that's the interesting point. I don't think that this constant, and I know there will be incredible energy efficient and incredible technology that will come on board, but I just don't think this drive for more, higher production, increased GDP, I don't think it is a fit with climate change and with turning things down.
Mhm, mhm.
And in fact, obviously, one of the silver linings of coronavirus is that we've seen that nature's just, you know, came back, you know, at such speed to places that were formerly polluted or formerly, you know, just didn't have the same level of flora or fauna.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like this happens across almost every industry. It's like during the 20th century, there was like a industrialization that like drove these processes of like standardization, you know, children lined up in schools, you know, like people on a conveyor belt in the same way that products are on a conveyor belt, and companies, you know, standardizing promotion routes and trying to standardize individuals into like defined roles that weren't necessarily uh, like tailored to them as an individual. And so many companies grew up during that period of time uh, of like standardization. And it's, but prior to that, you had a lot more kind of bespoke, tailored, like um, small communities and groups coming together to express themselves in kind of unique ways that were not the same stance, the same as one another. And you know, I guess you could say like Scottish distilleries were an example of that, where you have like all of these small distilleries coming to like making their own unique different blends. And then there was I mean I think I'm right in saying the Irish whiskey industry was like more of the distilleries were bought up over time, and kind of that decreased the variability of the different types of blends, and that might be one of the drivers why Scottish whiskey, um, there's a strength to be cut that comes from diversity
Mhm.
that standardization and industrialization doesn't really um, uh, capture, while while it does allow for efficiencies and cheaper prices, it doesn't maintain that kind of that tailored thing that comes from diversity. But I think that what we're kind of getting to, some of the forces that, so there's some forces like with social media that drive more efficiency and more kind of more of the same of the 20th century, but there's also an element of democratization of kind of access to market through, you know, online e-commerce
Mhm.
platforms where smaller companies can go to market and have just as big a shop front because of the internet, and they can go to market just in somebody's pocket because of smartphones. So I like this concept of uh, smaller brands that care more about community, family, like authenticity, kind of founder led type things that's got often there's like a story and a heritage behind the company that hasn't been stripped away by, you know, the forces of industrialization. I quite like the fact that we can use new digital tools in this new world to um, kind of harken back to the way things used to be. And there's a lot of good parts to that, and we can also use some of the efficiencies that we have to like allow them to get to market in a way that's not that they can still gain some economies of scale, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the defining elements of the 20th century into the first 20 years of the 21st century, I mean, the post industrial TV complex of industry and advertising, it was defined within the framework of the Cold War. So the reason why the USA and the USSR, as it was then, could drive production, industrial production, to such a crazy extent, because they had this fear of each other, often a manipulated fear as well. One of the fascinating, I think culturally sometimes we still consider that, for the UK, like many of our morals and cultural aspects are still a bit Victorian. And I just wonder how long that it will take before we look back at that period in the 50s and 60s, and just how much we're still dominated by this drive for up in GDP. And of course, that's what obviously won the Cold War, in the sense that the Russians just couldn't keep up with that when it got to the 1980s, because the efficiency of their industry just wasn't the same as the US. And I guess integral to that was the space race and the race to the moon, where I think the USA put something ridiculous like 5 to 10% of its GDP into this one element of getting man to the moon. But then the post 20 years after putting man on the moon, they all reaped the benefit, because it was the best capitalist socialist system that the USA never ever put in place. The investment was spread around the 50 states. There was huge amounts of employment. I think it was 300,000 to 400,000 people were working on this kind of crazy but aspirational dynamic of putting man on the moon. Now, what came after that? Well, Silicon Valley came after that as a direct result. All the Texas industrial industries came after that. So will COVID, or will the climate change emergency, as it is beginning to be referred at, what's that going to bring? Is it going to bring a new white heat of technology that is going to essentially make our conversation today very dated, because those technologies will come on board in the next 5
We'll
to
be
10
sitting
years
as holograms in some form of room that people can enter and watch.
Exactly, and obviously, authors like Yuval Harari, that's kind of what they're talking about. They're talking about, there will be a need for universal credit. There's the machines, and the artificial intelligence becomes more prominent in society. We will need to work less. We'll need to accept that. And the thing for me is, that's all fine, but how is it going to affect the environment? How is it going to affect, if the Cold War was a framework for mid to late 20th century, what is going to be the framework for now, post-COVID, going forward?
Yeah. And it's quite often not the thing that you think it's going to be. It's quite often, it could be like this epidemic, or it might not be. You never know how things are going to play out. I mean, there was the epidemic in 2018, but hardly anyone was talking about it, because everyone always referred back to the First and Second World Wars, but it's almost like pandemics were removed from the zeitgeist. And people just didn't even consider them, apart from, everyone's now touting Bill Gates's 2015 speech at the TED Talk, and looking back, it just seems like it was so obvious. Why didn't we do anything? But these things come out of the blue, and you can't plan for them, and then when they come, they change things. They make everything. They have the biggest impact. It's strange. Hey, we're at the hour. Do you want to maybe we'll call it, and maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point.
Part 2 with Unplanned with Phil Bland. As long as it's still unplanned, then I'm sure I'll be fine with that. It was good talking to you today, Phil. We covered a variety of subjects in a completely unplanned manner, which hopefully that's fitting with the style that you're trying to put forward. So good to chat to you, and hope all your other interviews go well, and send me the link for where this is going to be seen on YouTube.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.